just in the first year of sanctions. That's a huge sum of money. And sanctions aren't meant to push their economy over a cliff, but to put long-term pressure on Putin to change his behavior. Putin himself said in 2016 that sanctions are severely harming Russia. So, we know they've had success in putting pressure on the Kremlin. Admiral, what would it mean geopolitically? Would it help legitimate Russia's illegal land grab?
Sir, I'm not in a position to talk broadly about the geopolitical implications. I mean, we have stated previously, from an intelligence perspective, we have tried to outline to policymakers the specifics of the Russian invasion of Crimea, the specifics of the continued Russian support to separatists in the Ukraine, the Russians' continued attempt to pressure and to keep the Ukraine weak.
Would it help cleave the United States from her allies?
If we remove the sanctions?
There's a lot at stake here for Russia. This is big money, big strategic implications. If they can legitimate their annexation of Crimea, what's next? Are we looking at a new Iron Curtain descending across Eastern Europe? You know, most in our country recognize what is at stake and how the United States, as a leader of the free world, is the only check on Russian expansion. So, back to Mr. Trump and his cohort. At the Republican convention in July, Paul Manafort, Carter Page, and Trump himself changed the Republican Party platform to no longer arm Ukraine. So, the same month that Trump denied Putin's role in Ukraine, his team weakened the party platform on Ukraine. And, as we have and will continue to hear, this was the same month that several individuals in the Trump orbit held secret meetings with Russian officials, some of which may have been on the topic of sanctions against Russia for their intervention in Ukraine. Now, this is no coincidence, in my opinion. In fact, the dossier written by former MI6 agent Christopher Steele alleges that Trump agreed to sideline Russian intervention in Ukraine as a campaign issue, which is effectively a priority for Vladimir Putin. There's a lot in the dossier that is yet to be proven, but increasingly, as we'll hear throughout the day, allegations are checking out. And this one seems to be as accurate as they come. In fact, there is also one pattern I want to point out before yielding back. Manafort, fired. Page, fired. Flynn, fired. Why? They were hired because of their Russian connections. They were fired. However, because their connections became public, they were effectively culpable. But they were also the fall guys. So I think after we hear Mr. Quigley's line of questioning, we might guess who could be next. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, I yield back.
I yield the balance to Representative Speer.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service to our country. You know, I think it's really important as we sit here that we explain this to the American people in a way that they can understand it. Why are we talking about all of this? So my first question to each of you is Russia our adversary? Mr. Comey?
Yes.
Mr. Rogers?
Yes.
Do they intend to do us harm?
They intend to ensure, I believe, that they gain advantage at our expense.
Director Comey?
Yes, I want to be, harm can have many meanings. They're an adversary, and so they want to resist us, oppose us, undermine us in lots of different ways.
So one of the terms that we hear often is hybrid warfare. And I'd like to just give a short definition of what it is. It blends conventional warfare, irregular warfare, and cyber warfare. The aggressor intends to avoid attribution or retribution. So would you say that Russia engaged in hybrid warfare in its effort to undermine our democratic process and engage in our electoral process? Director Comey?
I don't think I would use the term warfare. I think you'd want to ask experts in the definition of war. They engaged in a multifaceted campaign of active measures to undermine our democracy and hurt one of the candidates and hope to help one of the other candidates.
I'd agree with the director.
All right. Well, thank you both. I actually think that their engagement was an act of war, an act of hybrid warfare, and I think that's why the American people should be concerned about it. Now, in terms of trying to understand this, I think of a spider web with a tarantula in the middle. And the tarantula, in my view, is Vladimir Putin, who is entrapping many people to do his bidding and to engage with him. And I would include those like Roger Stone and Carter Page and Michael Caputo and Wilbur Ross and Paul Manafort and Rex Tillerson. I'd like to focus first on Rex Tillerson in the 3 minutes I have here. He was the CEO of ExxonMobil. In 2008, he said that the likelihood of U.S.-Russia businesses was, in fact, a poor investment, that Russia was a poor investment climate. That was in 2008. In 2011, he closed a $500 billion deal with Rosneft Oil. The CEO of Rosneft is Igor Sechin, who is a confidant of President Putin, second most powerful man in Russia, and probably a former KGB agent. The deal gives Exxon access to the Black Sea and the Kara Sea and Siberia for oil development. Rosneft gets minority interest in Exxon in Texas and the Gulf. Rex Tillerson calls Sechin a good friend. In 2012, Mr. Tillerson and Mr. Sechin go on a road show here in the United States to talk about this great deal that they had just consummated. Also in 2012, there's a video of President Putin and Mr. Tillerson toasting champagne at the deal. And in 2013, Mr. Tillerson receives the Russian Order of Friendship. And he sits right next to President Putin at the event. So my question to you, Director Comey, is it of value to President Putin, knowing what you know of him and that his interest in doing harm to us, is it of benefit to Mr. Putin to have Rex Tillerson as the Secretary of State?
I can't answer that question.
Admiral Rogers?
Ma'am, I'm not in a position to answer that question.
All right. So in 2014, Igor Sechin is sanctioned. And he laments that he no longer will be able to come to the United States to motorcycle ride with Mr. Tillerson. Could you give me an understanding of what are some of the reasons that we impose sanctions? Director Comey?
On Sechin?
Well, just in general.
Again, you'd have to ask an expert, but from my general knowledge, it's to punish activities that are criminal in nature, that involve war crimes, that involve violations of UN resolutions or United States law in some other way. It's to communicate and enforce foreign policy interests and values of the United States of America. That's my general sense, but an expert might describe it much better.
Admiral Rogers?
I would echo the director's comments. It's also a tool that we use to attempt to drive and shape the choices and actions of others.
So in the case of Igor Sechin, who was sanctioned by the United States, in part to draw attention to the fact that Russia had invaded Crimea, it's an effort to try and send a very strong message to Russia. Is that not true?
I think that's right.
Yes, ma'am.
All right. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back for now.
Gentleman yields back. I'll yield myself 15 minutes and now yield to the Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Frost-Layton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. It's never acceptable, we can all agree, for any foreign power to interfere with our electoral process. And this committee has long been focused on Russia's reprehensible conduct, and we will remain focused on the threat emanating from Moscow. And I agree with you, Director Comey, when you say this investigation that is ongoing, we will follow the facts wherever they lead on a bipartisan level, and there will be no sacred cows. There are many important issues at stake, as you gentlemen have heard. There is bipartisan agreement on the danger of illegal leaks and our ability to reauthorize important programs upon which our intelligence community relies. But I want to assure the American people that there's also bipartisan agreement on getting to the bottom of Russian meddling in our election, which must remain the focus of this investigation and yours. So, Admiral Rogers, I agree in what you said, that a public acknowledgement of this foreign meddling to be a problem is important as we move forward. And following on Congressman LaBiando's questions and based on this theme, I'd like to ask you, gentlemen, if you could describe what, if anything, Russia did in this election that, to your knowledge, they did or they didn't do in previous elections. How were their actions different in this election than in previous ones?
I'd say the biggest difference from my perspective was both the use of cyber, the hacking, as a vehicle to physically gain access to information, to extract that information, and then to make it widely publicly available without any alteration or change.
The only thing that I'd add is they were unusually loud in their intervention. It's almost as if they didn't care that we knew what they were doing or that they wanted us to see what they were doing. It was very noisy, their intrusions in different institutions.
And what specifically, based on this loudness, did the FBI or the NSA do to prevent or counter this Russian active measure that we read about in the intelligence community assessment? As loud as they were, what did we do to counter that?
Well, among other things, we alerted people who had been victims of intrusions to permit them to tighten their systems to see if they couldn't kick the Russian actors out. We also, as a government, supplied information to all the states so they could equip themselves to make sure there was no successful effort to affect the vote, and there was none, as we said earlier. And then the government as a whole, in October, called it out. And I believe it was Director Clapper and then Secretary Jay Johnson issued a statement saying this is what the Russians are doing, as sort of an inoculation.
And the loudness to which you refer, perhaps they were doing these kinds of actions previously in other elections, but they were not doing it as loudly. Why do you think that they did not mind being loud and being found out?
I don't know the answer for sure. I think their number one mission is to undermine the credibility of our entire democracy enterprise, of this nation. And so it might be that they wanted us to help them by telling people what they were doing. Their loudness, in a way, would be counting on us to amplify it by telling the American people what we saw and freaking people out about how the Russians might be undermining our elections successfully. And so that might have been part of their plan. I don't know for sure.
I agree with Director Comey. I mean, a big difference to me in the past was while there was cyber activity, we never saw in previous presidential elections information being published in such a massive scale that had been, illegally removed, both from private individuals as well as organizations associated with the democratic process, both inside the government and outside the government.
And this massive amount and this loudness, now that it's become public knowledge, now that we have perhaps satisfied their thirst, that it has become such a huge deal, do you expect their interference to be amplified in future U.S. elections? Do you see any evidence of that in European elections? Or do you think that this public acknowledgement would tamper down their volatility?
I'll let Mike Rogers, maybe I'll just say as an initial matter, they'll be back. They'll be back in 2020, they may be back in 2018, and one of the lessons they may draw from this is that they were successful because they introduced chaos and division and discord and sowed doubt about the nature of this amazing country of ours and our democratic process. It's possible they're misreading that as it worked, and so we'll come back and hit them again in 2020. I don't know, but I think we have to assume they're coming back.
I fully expect them to continue this level of activity because our sense is that they have come to the conclusion that it generated a positive outcome for them in the sense that calling into question democratic process, for example, is one element of the strategy. We're working closely, our FBI teammates, others, we're working closely with our European teammates to provide the insights that we have seen to try to assist them as they themselves, France, in Germany, for example, about to undergo significant national leadership elections over the course of the next 2 months.
And in terms of the European elections, what have you seen or any information that you could share with us about the Russian interference?
So you've seen some of the same things that we saw in the U.S. in terms of disinformation, fake news, attempts to release of information to embarrass individuals. You're seeing that play out to some extent in European elections right now.
We look forward to continuing with you. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Turner's recognized. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Comey, Admiral Rogers, thank you for being here today and for your what appears to be attempts at being forthcoming with the committee. I also want to thank the chairman and the ranking member Schiff. This is a bipartisan effort. I think as you've looked to what this committee is undertaking, everyone wants answers, and everyone wants answers to all of the questions that are being asked, because this does go to such an important issue concerning our elections. Admiral Rogers, I'm going to begin with a question to you concerning the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Now, Admiral, as you know, that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act provides the circumstances or the authority under which the intelligence community may collect or intercept the communication of a foreign person located outside of the United States, or, as Mr. Comey has indicated, a person who is covered under a FISA court order. With Mr. Rooney and Mr. Gowdy, you discussed the minimization procedures under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and those minimization procedures are supposed to protect the privacy rights of U.S. citizens. Specifically, it's geared toward the communications of those who may be inadvertently or incidentally collected as a result of the intelligence community's lawful collection of communications of others. So, Mr. Rogers, is the intelligence community required to cease collection or the interception of communications if the result of the collection or interception includes the communications of an incoming U.S. administration official, the President-elect, or the President-elect's transition team?
It depends under what authority as I said early on, there's a series of questions we go through. Is there criminal associated activity? Does the conversation deal about threats to U.S. persons, breaking of the law? So there's no simple yes or no. There's a series of processes.
Mr. Rogers, is there any provision of minimization that requires you to cease collection? Because that is my question. Are you, under any circumstances, required to cease collection if the collection results in the either inadvertent or incidental collection of an incoming U.S. administration official, the President-elect, or the President-elect's transition team?
Purely on the basis of exposure of, I want to make sure I understand the question.
Are you required to cease? If you are undertaking lawful collection under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of a person or individual, either because they're a foreign person located outside the United States or the person that you're collecting against is the subject of a FISA court order, if incidental to that collection or inadvertently the collection results in the collection of communications of an incoming U.S. administration official, the President-elect, or the President-elect's transition team, are you required under the minimization procedures to cease collection?
Not automatically.
Thank you. So the answer is no. correct? Well, the reason why this is important is because intuitively, we would all know that an incoming administration would have conversations with those that the intelligence community may be collecting against, either by making phone calls to them or receiving phone calls to them. And so it's important for us to understand that the minimization procedures that are intended to collect the privacy rights of Americans do not inherently include a prohibition of the intelligence community, incidentally or inadvertently, collecting the communications of an incoming administration.
Yes, sir.
Now, Mr. Comey, are you aware whether or not the Director of National Intelligence, Director Clapper, ever briefed the President of the United States, then President Obama, concerning the possible inadvertent or incidental collection or interception by the U.S. intelligence community of any communication of members of the incoming Trump administration?
That's not something I can comment on.
And then why not, Mr. Comey?
A couple of reasons. It might involve classified information. It might involve communications with the President of the United States. On both of those grounds, I can't talk about it here.
Mr. Comey, have you previously discussed your conversations with President Obama with this committee?
Don't remember. It may have with the chair and ranking. I don't remember with the full committee.
Well, we'll have to refresh your memory on those conversations then. Mr. Comey, did President Obama ever acknowledge to you of having been briefed concerning possibly inadvertent or incidental collection or interception by the intelligence community of any communications of members of the incoming Trump administration?
I have to give you the same answer, Mr. Turner.
Well, Mr. Comey, the first question related to whether or not Mr. Clapper had briefed the President of the United States, and we'll certainly be following up with him. He is going to be appearing before us next week, and we'll certainly be directing the question to him also. So, Mr. Comey, are you aware of any evidence that General Flynn, prior to the inauguration, ever communicated to the Russian government or a Russian government official that the Trump administration in the future would release, rescind, or reverse U.S. sanctions against Russia, or ever made any offer of a quid pro quo for releasing, rescinding, or reversing U.S. sanctions against Russia? Are you aware of any evidence?
It's not something I can comment on, Mr. Turner.
And why is that?
I'm trying very hard not to talk about anything that relates to a U.S. person or that might rule in or rule out things we might be investigating. I'm trying to be studiously vague here to protect the integrity of the investigation. So please don't interpret, as I said at the beginning, please don't interpret my no comment as meaning this or meaning that. I just can't comment.
Well, Mr. Comey, there are statutes, guidelines, and procedures concerning what does it take for the FBI to open up a counterintelligence investigation into a U.S. citizen. It is not just subject to discretion. You can't just say, well, let's go look at somebody. You have to have a basis. You've now informed us that you've opened a counterintelligence investigation into the Trump campaign, members of the Trump campaign, concerning Russia in July of 2006. Now, we're trying to get a picture of what does it take to tip over for an investigation. Now, previously people have said that there have been individuals who attended a meeting with Russian officials, individuals who, a member who was paid to attend a conference, a picture that was taken, traveled to a foreign place. You know, there are many people, both in all of our administrations and sometimes, you know, certainly members who've left Congress who would qualify for that. What is the tipping point? I mean, it can't just be that. Don't you need some action or some information besides just attending a meeting, having been paid to attend a conference, that a picture was taken, or that you traveled to a country before you're open to investigation for counterintelligence by the FBI?
The standard is, I think there's a couple different at play, a credible allegation of wrongdoing or a reasonable basis to believe that an American may be acting as an agent of a foreign power.
Well, the reason why we're struggling with this, Mr. Comey, is that we obviously have the statements of Mr. Clapper that there's no evidence of collusion with Russia, and he just left the intelligence community. And as you are aware, we now sit, because as you said, Admiral Rogers, you know, the Russians wanted to put a cloud over our system. And Mr. Comey, by your announcement today, I mean, there is now a cloud that undermines our system. There is a cloud where we're sitting with Mr. Clapper, who is obviously in a very important position to know, who stated to us that there's no evidence of conclusion, and you will not give us evidence or give us any substantive evaluation of it. We now sit with this cloud, and it's unfortunate. Mr. Chairman, I have a few additional questions, if I might, when we regain time.
We'll get back to you, Mr. Turner. Mr. Schiff's recognized for 15 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I recognize Representative Jackie Spear.
Thank you, Mr. Schiff. And again, let's go back to this tarantula web. So Mr. Tillerson, in 2014, started to lobby the United States government, asking them to shift or lift the sanctions. Now, in his confirmation hearing, he says as he said, I have never lobbied against sanctions. Personally, to my knowledge, ExxonMobil never directly lobbied against sanctions. And yet there is lobbying reporting that shows that ExxonMobil actually paid over $300,000 to lobbyists in 2014, and that Mr. Tillerson visited the White House 5 times in 2014 and Treasury with Secretary Lew 7 times. Is there something disconcerting about a U.S. CEO attempting to undermine the sanctions imposed by our government against another country for acts that we find to be disadvantageous to the world order? Director Comey?
That's not a question I can answer for a variety of reasons. I'm not qualified to answer, and I shouldn't be answering questions like that.
Okay. How about this then? Is it disconcerting to you as the director of the FBI that a U.S. CEO would say publicly that he is very close friends with President Putin and has had a 17-year relationship with him?
That's not a question I can answer.
Would it raise any red flags?
Yeah, that's not a question I can answer.
Admiral Rogers?
Ma'am, lots of American corporations do business in Russia. I have no knowledge of the specifics we're talking about. I'm in no way qualified or knowledgeable enough to comment on this.
All right, let's move on to someone else in that web. His name is Michael Caputo. He's a PR professional, conservative radio talk show host. In 1994, he moved to Russia, and there he was working for the Agency for International Development. He was fired from that job because he refused to follow a State Department position. He then opened a PR firm in Moscow and married a Russian woman. He subsequently divorced her, and in 1999 his business failed. Roger Stone, a mentor to him, urged him to move to Florida and open his PR firm in Miami, which is exactly what Mr. Caputo did. And then in 2000, he worked with Gazprom Media to improve Putin's image in the United States. Now, do we know who Gazprom Media is? Do you know anything about Gazprom, Director?
I don't.
Well, it's an oil company. In 2007, he began consulting the Ukrainian parliamentary campaign. There he met his second wife. So I guess my question is, what possible reason is there for the Trump campaign to hire Putin's image consultant? Any thoughts on that, Director Comey?
No thoughts.
Admiral Rogers?
Likewise, ma'am.
All right. Do either of you know what Michael Caputo is doing for the Trump effort today?
I have no idea.
And I'm not going to talk about U.S. persons.
All right, let's move on now to Carter Page. Carter Page was the founder of Global Energy. It's an investment fund. He has only one partner, and that partner is Sergei Yatsenko, who's the former executive of a Russian state-owned Gazprom oil company. Before that, from 2004 to 2007, he worked for Merrill Lynch in Moscow. In March of 2016, then-candidate Trump referred to Carter Page as his foreign policy advisor to the Washington Post. The next day, Page asserts that he's an advisor on Russia and energy. But then subsequently, candidate Trump says he doesn't know him. On September 26th, he takes a leave of absence from the campaign, and then Page publicly supports a relationship with Russia, criticizes U.S. sanctions and NATO's approach to Russia, saying, and then subsequently says he's divesting his stake in Gazprom in August. In 2014, he writes an article criticizing the U.S. sanctions, praising Sechin in an article in Global Policy, and then rebuked the West for focusing on so-called annexation of Crimea. In July of 2016, he gives a graduation speech at the New Economics School, denies meeting with the Prime Minister. Christopher Steele, in his dossier, says he met with, again, Igor Sechin, offering a 19% interest in Rosneft. It becomes the biggest transfer of public property to private ownership. Now, Carter Page is a national security advisor to Donald Trump. Do you believe that, why do we, I guess, again, here's another company that has had sanctions imposed upon it. Could you again clarify why we impose sanctions on companies?
Admiral Rogers did it better than I, so I'm going to tap him.
I apologize. I don't remember the specifics of my answer, but I'll stand by my answer previously.
Which was excellent.
All right. I think at that point, I will yield back, Mr. Chair.
I now yield to Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. Thank you for being here. We've talked a little bit about the Russian playbook, right? Extortion, bribery, false news, disinformation. They all sound very familiar, correct? Well, as we talk, without thinking about anybody in the United States, just generally the Russian playbook and how it's worked in particularly Eastern Europe and Central Europe, a lot of it involves trying to influence individuals in that country, correct?
Yes.
So what we've talked about a little bit today seems to be sort of a black and white notion of whether there was collusion. But does a Russian active measure attempting to succeed at collusion, does the person involved have to actually know? I mean, does it have to involve knowing collusion for there to be damage?
I can answer generally. In the world of intelligence, oftentimes there are people who are called co-optees, who are acting, don't realize they're dealing with agents of a foreign power, and so are doing things for someone they think is a friend or a business associate, not realizing it's for the foreign government. So it can happen, and it's actually quite a frequent technique.
And is it beyond that sometimes to include things where the actor doesn't necessarily know what they're doing is helping that other government?
Exactly.
And what are instances, or just examples of what that might include in a generic sense in Europe and so forth?
Oftentimes a researcher here in the United States may think they're dealing with a peer researcher in a foreign government and not knowing that that researcher is either knowingly or unwittingly passing information to a foreign adversary of the United States.
And can you explain and elaborate how this sort of problems with defining what collusion is, the differences that might be involved with explicit or implicit collusion?
Collusion is not a legal term of art, and it's one I haven't used here today. I said we're investigating to see whether there was any coordination between people associated with the campaign.
Explicit or implicit coordination?
Well, I guess implicit I would think of it as knowing or unknowing.
Right.
You can do things to help a foreign nation state, as I said, without realizing that you're dealing with, you think you're helping a buddy who's a researcher at a university in China, when what you're actually doing is passing information that ends up with the Chinese government. That's unwitting. I don't know whether it's the same as your implicit. Explicit would be, I'm sending this stuff to this researcher in China, and I'm doing it because I want to help the Chinese government, and I know he's hooked up with the Chinese government.
Admiral Rogers, would you give other examples of what you've witnessed in your career?
Sometimes U.S. individuals will be approached by other individuals connected with foreign connections who will misrepresent what they're not just a researcher. They'll assume an identity, if you will. Hey, I want you to think that I'm actually working for a business, exploring a commercial interest, those kinds of things, create a relationship, and then it turns out there really is no commercial interest here. They're acting as a direct extension of a foreign government.
And romance can be a feature, right? Somebody dating someone to create a close relationship, and the U.S. government person thinks that they're in love with this person, and vice versa, and the other person is actually an agent of a foreign power. That's sort of a classic example.
Describe this as naive acquiescence?
I'm not sure I know what that means.
I don't know what that really means.
You're going along with it without really acknowledging, understanding in your mind, or being naive about the issue.
Sure, that can happen.
You see that at times.
Okay. Going on to things that you probably can't comment upon, which is of equal concern. We're all, at this point, very familiar with Mr. Sessions' testimony before the United States Senate, in which he specifically said he wasn't one who had this contact with the Russians. And then there was the amended, testimony in which he acknowledged, I believe, two such testimonies. The first was in July during the convention, and then later in September afterwards. All the while that the issues that we are talking about today, the hacking, the dumping of materials, were taking place, and certainly someone in the position of Mr. Senator Sessions would have been aware of this, perhaps would have remembered these conversations, or might have mentioned, asked the Russian ambassador to knock it off. But apparently none of those things happened, or at least he didn't remember that they happened. Unfortunately, what we're reading now is that there was a third meeting as early as April of last year in Washington, D.C., a meeting in which candidate Trump was president and the Russian ambassador was president. At some point in time, this goes well beyond an innocent, under the best of circumstances, oh, I forgot sort of thing, or that doesn't count. When you correct your testimony in front of the United States Senate, you're still under oath, and you're swearing to the American people that what you're saying is true. So the third time is well beyond that and is quite simply perjury. So as we look at this, as we go forward, gentlemen, I ask that you take that into consideration. This is far more than what we have talked about, just in the general sense, did the Russians hack or not, and the scope of this, to a concerted effort and plan to lie to the American public about what took place and what the motivations were beyond this process. Again, I thank you for your service, and I yield back to the ranking member.
I yield to Mr. Swalwell of California.
Thank you, Director Comey and Admiral Rogers. Director Comey, you've served time in a courtroom as a prosecutor, and I'm wondering if you remember the instruction that is read to juries every day that if you decide that a witness deliberately lied about something significant in this case, you should consider not believing anything that witness says.
Yep, that's familiar to me.
And your testimony at the beginning of this hearing was that President Trump's claims that former President Obama had wiretapped him is false.
I said we have no information that supports them.
Thank you. With respect to Donald Trump, do you remember the other instruction relating to truthfulness of a witness or a defendant? If a defendant makes a false or misleading statement relating to the charged crime, knowing the statement was false or intending to mislead, that conduct may also show he or she were aware of their guilt.
Yep, familiar to me from my distant past.
I want to talk about the Kremlin playbook. And there are a number of ways that a foreign adversary could seek to influence a person. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Financial?
Yes, that can be one.
Romance, you said, is another.
Yes.
Compromise?
Correct.
Setting up a compromise?
Sure, to execute on a compromise, yes.
How about inadvertently capturing a compromise? Meaning they have vast surveillance and you stumble into that surveillance and are caught in a compromise.
And then they take that information, try and use it to coerce you? Yeah,
Right.
that's part of the playbook.
Okay. I'll yield back, Chair, and continue once time's back with us.
Gentleman's time
Thank
has
you, Director.
expired. We'll go back to Mr. Turner.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I want to go back to the issue of Admiral Rogers indicated that the goal of the Russians is to put a cloud on our system, to undermine our system. And I would think certainly today, Mr. Comey, with your announcement of an investigation, that the Russians would be very happy with that as an outcome, because the cloud of their actions and activities continues and will continue to undermine until you're finished with whatever your investigation is currently in the scope of. But I want to go back to the issue of how does one open an investigation, because again, I'm a little confused by some of the things that we hear as to the basis of an investigation. Now, Mr. Comey, if an individual attends a meeting with a foreign leader, is that enough to open a counterintelligence investigation?
Without more that somebody met with somebody? No.
No, okay. Without more, then, if they had their picture taken with a foreign leader, is that enough?
It would depend upon where they were, who took the picture.
Well, assume that they're in the foreign country and in that foreign leader's government offices or facilities. If they're having a picture taken with them, is that enough to open a counterintelligence investigation?
It would depend.
On what? I mean, because I'm saying if there's just a picture. Because I can tell you certainly there's lots of people who've had lots of pictures.
Yeah.
Is it enough that a person has just had their picture taken with a foreign leader at the foreign leader's government official offices or place of residence?
The reason I said it depends is it would depend. Did the person sneak over to the foreign country and meet them clandestinely? Was the picture reveal something else about the relationship? It's just hard to answer.
Let's say it's not clandestine. Let's say it's open, that the person has attended an event and has gone over to meet with the foreign person, foreign government official, and is at their foreign government official facility or their official residence and has a picture taken and has no intention of covertly being present with the foreign person. Is that picture enough to open a counterintelligence investigation?
Tricky to answer hypotheticals, but I think my reaction to that is that doesn't strike me as enough. Now, I know your next question is going to be deeper into hypos.
No, I'm not getting deeper into the hypos. These are pretty straightforward. What if you're paid, to attend a conference in a foreign country, and you're paid to attend that conference not directly by the foreign government, but nonetheless, payment does occur for you to attend a conference. Certainly, we know President Bill Clinton attended many such conferences and spoke and received payment. Is receiving payment by attending to speak at a conference, again, it's not covert, it's open. They're attending to speak at a conference. They receive payment for the purposes of speaking. Is that enough to open a counterintelligence investigation?
I can't say as I sit here. It would depend upon a lot of different things.